17-year-old Eliza Ann Whitfield stood frozen beside the cradle, her dead husband's rifle clutched in her trembling hands. Standing outside her leaning chestnut log cabin was a giant in a soaked black oilskin, a deep scar slashed across his throat, carrying a bleeding stranger over his shoulder like a sack of feed. Letting him inside meant inviting death into a house with a sleeping baby. Turning him away meant his blood would freeze onto her porch boards by morning. Her choice that wet autumn night would unravel a corruption that stretched from the silent mountain hollers all the way to the federal courthouse in Raleigh. The autumn of 1897 came down hard on the Blue Ridge Mountains, the long cold rains turning to sleet by the last week of October. Folks in the high hollers said the weather had a meanness in it that year, like the sky itself was grieving something it could not name. The leaves had turned and fallen too early, leaving the ridges bare and black against a sky the color of cold iron. In a sagging cabin 4 miles outside the dying logging camp of Hollow Creek, North Carolina, Eliza Ann Whitfield was running out of everything. Food, kerosene, hope. Her husband, Jacob, had been crushed by a falling poplar tree on the 2nd day of April, 6 months and 12 days ago. She had counted every one. The logging foreman had brought his body home in the back of a wagon, hat in hand, and given her $4 in scrip for the trouble. $4, that was what Jacob had been worth to the Hollow Creek Lumber Company. She had been 15 when they married, and Jacob had been a steady man, 24, slow of speech and gentle of hand. He had built the cabin himself, board by warped board, on a ridge his uncle had left him. Now Jacob was buried under a flat creek stone behind the smokehouse, and Eliza was 17 years old, alone with their 6-month-old son, Thomas, a near-empty larder, and a single-shot Stevens rifle leaned against the doorframe. She was thin from a hard summer, with chestnut hair she kept braided down her back and dark eyes that had learned to hold still when they wanted to cry. Her mother had been a granny woman down in McDowell County before the consumption took her, and from her Eliza had inherited a stubborn streak and a small leather pouch of dried herbs that hung from a peg above the stove. The sleet rattled against the tin roof like a handful of pebbles thrown by a child. Eliza sat in her mother's old rocker, the Stevens across her lap, the cradle pulled close to her knee. Thomas slept with his small fist curled under his chin, breathing the slow, even breaths of a baby who did not yet know his father was dead. Then came the sound. It was not the wind. It was a heavy, slow rhythm against the warped pine of the front door. Thump, thump, thump. Eliza's heart climbed into her throat. There were no neighbors for 4 miles in any direction. The Hollow Creek wagon road was washed out from the autumn rains. No drummer or peddler would be out on a night like this, and the bears were already denning. She set her thumb against the hammer of the Stevens and drew it back with a soft metallic click that sounded enormous in the small room. "Who's out there?" she called, and hated how thin her voice sounded. Only the sleet answered. Then came a second knock, weaker, and a voice. But the voice was wrong. It was a rasping, half-strangled whisper, like a man trying to call out through a mouthful of broken glass. "Ma'am, I got a man dying out here. Please." Eliza did not move for a long moment. Her mother's voice came to her faint and far off from a memory of a summer kitchen in McDowell County. A door opened in kindness is a door the Lord remembers. But her father's voice came too, harder and closer. A door opened to a stranger in the dark is a grave dug for a fool. Thomas stirred in the cradle, made a small soft sound, and settled again. She crossed to the door with the Stevens raised, lifted the heavy oak bar, and cracked the door open the width of 2 fingers. The wind tore it out of her hand and slammed it back against the wall. Standing on her porch in the sleet was the largest man Eliza Ann Whitfield had ever seen. He stood near 6.5 feet, broad as a barn door, draped in a long black oilskin duster that ran with water. A wide felt hat was pulled low over steel-gray eyes that caught the lamplight from inside. A thick, dark beard, shot through with gray, covered most of his face, but it could not hide the deep ridged scar that ran across his throat from one side to the other, an old wound, white and puckered. His left hand, gripping the limp body slung over his shoulder, was missing 2 fingers, the smallest and the one beside it, and the stumps were old, healed years ago. Over his shoulder he carried a man, a smaller man, perhaps 50, in a fine wool overcoat soaked through with dark blood. The man's head hung loose. His face was the color of tallow. The giant's grey eyes flicked to the Stevens, to Eliza's face, to the cradle visible behind her, and back to the Stevens. "Lower the gun, ma'am," he rasped. The voice was a ruin, every word dragged up through something broken. "If I meant you harm, I would not have knocked. Who are you?" Eliza demanded. She kept the rifle level, though her arms shook. "Caleb Royston, this man is gut-shot and bleeding out. I need a fire, water, and clean cloth. After that, if you want me gone, I go." Something in the way he said it, not pleading, not demanding, just laying the facts out like cordwood, made her step back. He took it as permission, ducked his head beneath the lintel, and carried the wounded man inside. He laid him down on the rag rug by the stove with a gentleness that surprised her, the way a man might lay down a sleeping child. The wounded man wore a fine watch chain across his vest, and his boots were store-bought, not handmade. A gentleman's clothes, ruined. "His name is Beckworth," Caleb rasped, already shrugging out of the soaked oilskin. Beneath it he wore homespun and a heavy leather belt with a long Bowie knife and a Colt revolver. Marshal Owen Beckworth. He took a ball through the side, low down. "Who shot him?" Eliza asked. Caleb did not look up. He was already cutting away the wool vest with the Bowie knife, his ruined left hand surprisingly deft. "A man with a grievance," he said. Eliza set the Stevens down within reach, fetched the kettle from the stove, and tore a clean flour sack into strips. As she knelt beside Caleb, her bare forearm brushed his, and she felt the heat of him through the damp shirt, and the strange iron stillness of a man who had been doing hard, violent work and was now doing careful, gentle work with the same hands. She glanced at his face. He was watching the wound, not her. But she saw the corner of his mouth tighten when her arm touched his, the smallest flinch, as if it had been a long time since any soft thing had touched him at all. The sleet came down for 2 days and 2 nights without stopping. By the morning of the first day, the ridge road below the cabin was a ribbon of glass, and Caleb Royston could no more leave than fly. He did not seem in a hurry to try. He moved through Eliza's small house as if he had been measured for it, ducking the low beam over the stove, sliding sideways past the cradle, setting down his enormous boots with a care that made no sound on the plank floor. He chopped a full week of firewood in the space of an afternoon, the axe singing in a steady rhythm that Eliza could feel through the soles of her feet. He climbed onto the roof in the freezing rain and patched the place where the sod had pulled away from the chimney, plugging it with cedar shake and pine pitch from his saddlebag. He brought in from his mule, which he had stabled in her dead husband's lean-to, a tied bundle of smoked venison, a small canvas sack of cornmeal, and a tin of black coffee. That night, Eliza ate her first full meal in 3 weeks. She ate slowly, ashamed of how her hands shook, and when she finally set the spoon down, she discovered Caleb had not been watching her. He had been looking at Thomas in the cradle, and the look on his face was the look of a man standing outside a house he could not enter. "You have children, Mr. Royston?" she asked. Before she could think better of it, he was quiet for a long moment. Then his ruined hand went to his coat pocket and came out with a small object which he turned over once in his fingers and put back. He did it without seeming to notice he had done it. "I had a wife," he rasped. "She passed 2 years back. I have a daughter, Sarah May. She is 6. Where is she now? With kin," he said, and the word came out flat as a stone dropped in still water, safe enough. Eliza did not press him. She had learned in 6 months of widowhood that there were some questions you did not ask a grieving person because the answers were a debt they could not pay. She turned instead to Marshal Beckworth, who lay sweating on the rag rug, his breath shallow and quick. The wound in his side had begun to smell sweet, the smell her mother had taught her to fear above all others. She fetched down the leather pouch from above the stove, set water to boil, and made a poultice of yarrow leaf, golden seal root, and the inner bark of a white willow she had stripped herself in September. She packed the wound, bound it tight with the flour sack strips, and dribbled a willow bark tea between the marshal's cracked lips. Caleb watched her work without speaking. When she finished and sat back on her heels, he said, very low, "Where did a girl your age learn that?" "My mother. She was a granny woman. She taught you well. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron. She said the mountain gives you what you need if you know where to look. She was right. She looked up at him then and noticed for the first time that his shirt on the left side, beneath the ribs, was dark with old dried blood. He had been hiding a wound of his own for 2 days. "Take off your shirt, Mr. Royston," she said. He looked at her. "You are bleeding through your own bandage," she said. "I cannot have 2 dying men on my floor. Take it off." A slow, surprised something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might once have lived. He pulled the homespun shirt over his head. The gash along his ribs was 4 inches long and the edges were angry. She cleaned it with hot water and pine tar soap, made a second poultice, and bound him with the last of her clean cloth. His skin under her hands was hot and scarred in many places, old scars layered over older ones. The body of a man who had lived a hard life and refused to die of it. She did not let her hands linger. But when she tied off the last knot of the bandage, her fingertips brushed the bare skin above his hip, and she felt him go very still under her touch, the way a deer goes still in a clearing when it knows it is being watched. Neither of them spoke. The fire popped. Thomas made a small sleeping sound in the cradle. Caleb pulled his shirt back on and went to sit by the door, his back to the wall, the way a man sits who has long ago learned never to put his back to a room on the second night. The sleet eased to a thin, steady rain, and the fire burned low, and Thomas slept, and Marshall Beckworth slept the deep, cloudy sleep of a man whose fever was breaking. Eliza sat in her mother's rocker, and Caleb sat at the table with a tin cup of coffee. And for a little while the cabin was the warmest, quietest place in the world. "You said your wife passed," Eliza said. She kept her voice low. "How?" Caleb turned the tin whistle over in his ruined fingers. She had not seen him take it out. But there it was, a small thing carved of soft pine and wrapped in a strip of leather. He looked at it as if it were a window he could see his wife through. "It is a long story," he rasped, "and not a kind one. I have time." He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. "Her name was Ruth," he said at last. "I made my living running a copper still up on Hawksbill Ridge. It was not a fortune, but it was ours. We had a girl child, Sarah May, and the 3 of us lived in a cabin not much bigger than this one." He turned the whistle. "She had a way with a song. Ruth did. She used to sing while she stirred the mash." He set the whistle down on the table. 2 years back, in November, some men came up the ridge. They wanted a thing she would not give them. They beat her, Miss Whitfield. They beat her until she could not stand, and she was carrying our second child, and she lost the baby that night, and she lost herself with it 3 days after. Eliza did not move. "My turn now," Caleb said. He looked up at her, and the steel-gray eyes were dry, which was somehow worse than tears. "Your husband, a poplar tree," Eliza said. "On the 2nd of April, the foreman gave me $4. $4. $4. He nodded once, slowly, as if she had told him something he had already known. He reached across the table and laid his ruined left hand, palm up, on the boards between them. He did not ask her for anything. He just left the hand there. After a moment, Eliza laid her own small hand inside it. His fingers closed around hers very gently, as if she were a thing made of paper. She felt the calluses, and the ridge of a long-heeled cut along the back of his thumb, and the warmth of him, and she felt something that had been frozen inside her chest for 6 months and 12 days break apart and begin to thaw. Neither of them spoke. The fire shifted in the stove. From the rag rug, Marshall Owen Beckworth opened his eyes. He saw the 2 hands on the table. He saw Caleb's face. And the look that came into his sallow features was the most pure and venomous hatred Eliza had ever seen on a human face. "Get away from him, girl," Beckworth wheezed. "That man is a moonshiner and a murderer, and there is a federal warrant on his head." Eliza pulled her hand back as if from a hot stove. She stood up, and the rocker rocked behind her, empty. "What did you say?" Beckworth tried to push himself up on one elbow. He failed and fell back, gasping. A line of pink-flecked spit ran from the corner of his mouth. "I am Marshall Owen Beckworth, Federal Revenue Service. That man has been wanted across 3 counties for 6 years. He runs an illegal still. He has killed 2 of my deputies. and he shot me 2 nights ago up on the Linville River." "Get the rifle. Get away from him." Eliza turned to Caleb. He had not moved. He sat at the table with his ruined hand still open on the boards where she had left it. "Is it true?" she asked. "Yes," he rasped. "All of it. I run as still. I shot him. I killed 2 of his men." The cabin tilted around her. She gripped the edge of the table. Thomas, sensing something through the air the way babies do, began to fuss in the cradle. "You lied to me." "I did not lie to you, Miss Whitfield. I have not lied to you about one thing." His voice was steady, the broken rasp of it almost calm. "But I have not yet told you all of it. And I am asking you, before you take that rifle down from over the door, to let me tell you the rest. He is going to kill me, girl." Beckworth wheezed from the floor. "And then he is going to kill you, and he is going to kill that baby, because he cannot leave a witness. That is what his kind does." Caleb's right hand drifted, slow and easy, toward the Bowie knife at his belt. Eliza did not think. She stepped between them. She put her own body between the man on the floor and the man at the table, and she said, "No, no, you will not. Not in this house, not with my baby in that cradle. You will sit down at this table, Mr. Royston, and you will tell me the rest of it. Now." Caleb's hand stopped halfway to the knife. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the rain on the tin roof, and Thomas's small rising fuss, and the wet rattle of Marshal Beckworth's breathing. Then Caleb's hand came back to the table and lay flat. "Sit down, Miss Whitfield," he said. "Please." She did not sit. She stood her ground between them, the way her mother had once stood between her father and a tax collector with a writ, and she said, "Talk." Caleb Royston talked. He talked low in that ruined, rasping voice, and he did not look away from her face once. He told her that Marshal Owen Beckworth had been the federal revenue agent for the western counties of North Carolina for 6 years. He told her that in those 6 years, Beckworth and his deputies had run an extortion racket out of every still and small farm from the French Broad to the Watauga. The way of it was simple. A man with a still paid Beckworth a tax every quarter in cash money or in jugs, or Beckworth burned him out and called it federal enforcement. A man with a farm paid the same tax, or Beckworth's men found a reason, a missing horse, a stolen hog, a piece of paper, and the farm was foreclosed, and Beckworth's brother-in-law in Asheville bought it at auction for pennies. 6 years. 3 counties, dozens of families Ruth would not pay. Caleb said. "I was down the mountain that week selling a load in Morganton. They came up the ridge, and they told her the tax was due, and she told them she would pay it when I returned. They told her it was due that day. She told them no. There were 4 of them. She was alone with Sarah May." He stopped. He picked up the tin whistle from the table and put it down again. "They beat her in front of my daughter. Sarah May was 4 years old. They beat my wife until she could not stand. And then they left, because they thought she would live and pay the next quarter. She did not live. She lost the child she was carrying, and then she lost herself, and Sarah May watched it all. Eliza had a hand pressed over her mouth. She did not remember putting it there. I hunted them," Caleb said. "I took 2 years. I found the first one in a boarding house in Marion, and the second one on the road outside Old Fort. The third one I shot 2 nights ago on the Linville River, and the 4th one is lying on your rug." "Lies," Beckworth whispered from the floor. "Mountain lies. He is a killer and a thief." "He is the killer," Caleb said, not looking at him, "and the thief." "And the law." He stood up slowly from the table. "There is one more thing, Miss Whitfield. The reason I am here on this ridge on this night. When I shot Beckworth 2 nights back, his remaining deputies got away. They knew I would come for them next, so they did the only thing they could think to do." He stopped and his throat worked. "They went up to my sister's place on Hawksbill, and they took Sarah May. They have her now in Asheville, in a cooperage off Lexington Avenue that belongs to Beckworth's brother-in-law. There are 4 men holding her. They sent word to me by a boy on a mule yesterday morning. If I do not bring them this man alive and forget my grievance, they will sell my daughter to a sporting house in Knoxville." The cabin was very quiet. "She is 6 years old, Miss Whitfield," Caleb said. From the floor, Marshal Beckworth began to laugh. It was a wet, ugly, breathless laugh, the laugh of a man who has nothing left but the meanness in his own chest. He laughed until he coughed, and he coughed pink onto the rag rug. And when he could speak again, he said, "The girl is leverage. That is all. The girl is an asset. Business is business in these mountains, Royston, and you should have paid your tax." In one motion that Eliza did not even see begin, Beckworth's hand was inside his bloody vest, and out of it came a small two-shot Derringer he had hidden there for 2 days. He did not aim it at Caleb. He grabbed Eliza by the wrist with a strength a dying man should not have had, yanked her down and back against his chest, and pressed the cold muzzle of the Derringer against the soft place behind her ear. Back away from the table, Royston, back to the wall. "I am leaving this cabin, and she is coming with me until I find a horse, and then if she is lucky I will leave her by the road." Caleb went very still. Thomas, in the cradle, began to cry in earnest now, the long rising wail of a baby who has felt the air in the room change. Eliza thought of Jacob under the flat creek stone behind the smokehouse. She thought of her mother in McDowell County. She thought of her son in the cradle, and of a 6-year-old girl in a copperage in Asheville, and of every woman on every ridge in 3 counties who had paid a tax to this man or buried someone who would not. Marshall Owen Beckworth was gut-shot, feverish, and weak. He had been on her floor for 2 days. His grip on her wrist was hard, but his other arm, the one holding the Derringer, was trembling. She could feel the tremor of it against her jaw. She let her body sag against him as if she were fainting. She felt him take her weight, surprised, off balance, and she drove the heel of her boot down into the packed wound in his side with every ounce of strength in her 17-year-old body. Beckworth shrieked. The Derringer fired into the rafters with a flat, sharp crack, and a shower of splinters rained down. His grip broke. Eliza rolled away across the floor and came up beside the cradle. Caleb crossed the cabin in 2 strides. He took the Derringer out of Beckworth's hand and threw it across the room, and then his ruined left hand closed around the marshal's throat. "Caleb," Eliza said. He did not seem to hear her. "Caleb, look at me." His head turned. The steel-gray eyes were a long way off. "If you kill him," Eliza said, "you will never find Sarah May in time. You need him alive long enough to tell us exactly where she is, exactly which door, exactly how many men. Then you can do what you need to do." Caleb's hand trembled. Slowly, slowly, it opened. He hauled Beckworth up by the lapels of the ruined wool overcoat and slammed him against the cabin wall, hard enough to rattle the tin plates on the shelf. "Where is my daughter?" Beckworth's mouth worked. He had nothing left. "The Whitcomb Cooperage," he whispered. "Lexington Avenue, South End. There is a side door off the alley. 4 men. Sarah May is in the small office at the back. The key is on a nail by the loading bay." Caleb dropped him. He turned to Eliza, and his chest was heaving, and his ruined hand was shaking, and he said very softly, "Thank you." She picked up Thomas from the cradle and held him against her shoulder, and the baby quieted, and outside the rain on the tin roof began at last to ease. By dawn the rain had stopped, and a hard pale sun came up over the Blue Ridge for the first time in 3 days. The world dripped and glittered. Caleb Royston tied Marshall Owen Beckworth to the iron leg of the stove with a length of harness leather, set a tin cup of water and a piece of cornbread within reach of his bound hands, and walked out without looking at him a second time. "The logging patrol comes through this ridge by Friday," he told Eliza. "He will keep until then." "That is more mercy than he gave my Ruth." Eliza was already dressed in Jacob's heavy wool coat, the sleeves rolled twice. She had wrapped Thomas in 2 layers of oilskin against her chest in a sling she had cut from a clean flour sack. The Stevens rifle was slung on her shoulder. The leather pouch of herbs hung at her hip. Caleb looked at the baby and at her and started to speak. "Do not," Eliza said. "Do not tell me to stay. There is nowhere safe for me on this ridge with that man on my floor, and there is a 6-year-old girl in a cooperage in Asheville who needs every hand the Lord can send her. I am coming." He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded once. "You ride behind me," he said. "You do exactly as I say. When we get to Asheville, you stay where I put you until I say different. Understood?" "Understood." They rode out on his mule, a tall, raw-boned animal named Job, down the slick ridge road and along the swollen Catawba, and then west through the gaps. It took them 2 days. They slept the first night in an empty tobacco barn. The 3 of them huddled together under the oilskin and the wolf-gray of Caleb's duster, Thomas warm between them. Eliza woke once in the dark and found Caleb awake too, watching the door of the barn, one hand resting on the stock of his revolver and the other, the ruined one, resting very lightly on her shoulder, as if he were not sure he was allowed to leave it there. She did not move. After a little while he closed his eyes. They came into Asheville at dusk on the second day by the back roads, past the rail yards and the brick warehouses along the French Broad. The Whitcomb Cooperage stood at the south end of Lexington Avenue, a long low warehouse of dark timber with a loading bay at one end and a small office at the other. Stacked floor to rafters along the walls were oak whiskey barrels, hundreds of them, and the smell of new wood and wet hoops hung in the alley. Caleb dismounted in the shadow of a feed store across the way. He helped Eliza down with the baby still strapped to her chest. "You stay in this alley," he said, "behind the rain barrel. If I'm not out in a quarter hour, you take Job and you ride north, and you do not look back. There is a Methodist family in Wiverville named Calhoun. Tell them Caleb Royston sent you. They will see you safe. Caleb, promise me." She did not promise him. She nodded, which was not the same. He went around the back of the Cooperage and was gone. Eliza crouched behind the rain barrel in the freezing alley with Thomas warm against her ribs. She counted her breaths. She counted to 60 and started again. Somewhere inside the warehouse a man laughed. Somewhere a barrel was rolled across a wood floor. On her fourth count of 60, the first shot came from inside the Cooperage. Then two more, fast, and a man shouted, and then a small high voice that did not belong in that place screamed, "Daddy." Eliza moved. She did not move toward the back of the Cooperage where Caleb had gone. She moved to the side of the warehouse where a small window stood half open above a heap of Cooperage shavings. The curled blonde shavings the Coopers swept out at the end of each day, dry as tinder, piled 3 feet deep against the timber wall. In her mother's herb pouch was a small tin of lucifer matches wrapped in waxed paper against the damp. Eliza set Thomas in the sling against the alley wall behind the rain barrel, where the baby could not see what she did. She took out the matches. She struck 3 of them together against the side of the tin and dropped them into the dry shavings. The pile caught with a soft, hungry sound. Yellow flame climbed the timber wall. Gray smoke poured up the wall and in through the open window, and in seconds the inside of the Cooperage was full of it inside. Men began to cough. A man swore. A door banged open at the loading bay end, and 2 of Beckwith's deputies stumbled out into the alley on the far side, choking and waving their pistols at nothing. Eliza stayed where she was, low behind the rain barrel, the Stevens across her knees. She did not need to fire it. The smoke was doing what bullets could not. Inside the warehouse, in the confusion and the gray dark, Caleb Royston came through the back office door with his Bowie knife in his right hand and Sarah May in his left arm. The last of the 4 guards came at him out of the smoke, and Caleb met him with the knife. Low and quick, and the guard went down and did not get up. Caleb came out of the Cooperage carrying his daughter. She was barefoot in a thin calico dress, her face streaked with tears and Cooperage dust. Her arms were locked around his neck so tightly Eliza could see her small knuckles white in the firelight. Caleb's left side was wet with new blood, but he was walking. Eliza came out from behind the rain barrel with Thomas in the sling. The fire had begun to climb the Cooperage wall in earnest now, and somewhere down Lexington Avenue a bell was ringing. They had minutes no more. Caleb looked at her over the head of his daughter. He did not speak. The steel-gray eyes said everything that needed saying. They rode out of Asheville that night by the North Road, the mule job laboring under the 3 of them, and the baby, the Cooperage burning bright behind them against a sky the color of cold iron. 3 years later, in a small green valley on the far side of the Tennessee line, a homestead stood at the edge of a clear creek. There were 2 cabins joined by a covered dog trot, a smokehouse, a barn, a low stone springhouse, and a fenced garden where chestnut-haired Eliza Royston grew yarrow and golden seal and white willow from cuttings she had carried across the mountains in her mother's leather pouch. In the dooryard on a bright spring morning, a small boy of 3 years old chased a girl of 9 through the wet grass. The girl, Sarah May, was laughing. The boy, Thomas, was blowing on a small tin whistle carved of soft pine and wrapped in a strip of leather, the one his father, for he had been Thomas's father now for 2 of his 3 years, had given him on his last birthday. On the porch, Caleb Royston sat in a hickory chair with his ruined left hand resting on the small of his wife's back. Eliza leaned against the porch post with a tin cup of coffee in her hand and watched the children run. Down in Asheville, the name of Marshal Owen Beckworth had been struck from the federal rolls 2 years back after a logging patrol out of Hollow Creek had found him tied to a stove in an abandoned cabin and brought him in raving about moonshiners and a girl with a rifle. He had been tried for the extortion of mountain families across 3 counties, and he had hanged for it on a Tuesday in March. The story of who had brought him to that stove had never been told, and never would be. In the high hollows of the Blue Ridge, the old women said that the mountain remembered. The mountain remembered every woman beaten in her own kitchen, every farm taken at auction, every child sold down the line. The mountain remembered, and now and again, when the rain turned to sleet and the door knocked in the dark, the mountain answered. Eliza Ann Whitfield had offered shelter for one night to a giant in a soaked oilskin with a scar across his throat and a dying man over his shoulder. She had opened her door against every warning her father had ever given her, and she had been given back in return a daughter, a husband, a home, and a justice the federal courts had never been brave enough to deliver. The badge does not make the man. Sometimes the law is the criminal, and the criminal is the only justice left for the poor. She finished her coffee. She watched her son blow into his father's whistle. And she watched her daughter laugh. And she thought, as she had thought every spring morning for 3 years, that a door opened in kindness was a door the Lord remembered after all.